So, let me present you Dr. Lucas Moreno. He has working in drug development since he finished his fellowship, and now he's working in Hospital Niño Jesús in Madrid after 5 years being in Royal Marsden in UK. So he's going to tell us about clinical trials in AYA patients. Thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon. I'd give very, very special thanks to the organizers for the very kind invitation, but particularly to Alvaro, because working alongside with him over these past months, you really realize the huge effort that takes to organize such a meeting. So I'm delighted to be here talking about new drugs and new trials for adolescents and young adults with cancer, and hopefully between all of us are going to achieve some advances for our patients. So I'll touch on 3 main areas over the talk. I'll very briefly talk about participation, overall participation in clinical trials for adolescents and young adults with cancer, but we'll mainly concentrate on the development, on how new drugs are developed and which specific points we need to take into account when we're talking about AYA cancers, and then discuss about the practicalities of how to treat adolescents in early clinical trials, how to get access to the new treatments. So if you search the literature, there's a good number of papers relating to do adolescents participate into clinical trials? How many of them do they have equal access to clinical trials as others? And I'll just want to highlight this figure, which is from one of the authors of these papers. If you see, for pediatrics, approximately 60% of patients are treated in clinical trials. All frontline treatments are within cooperative group protocols, and this has helped enormously to incorporate multimodal treatment and to make advances in survival. And that comes dramatically down as the age progresses. If you are 15 to 19, that is just 34%, and that just goes down with the age. So participating in clinical trials, and this refers majorly to large phase 3 cooperative group clinical trials, but has a number of advantages for the patients, and these are to have a more controlled environment. You know, the European protocol for neuroblastoma is open in 26 countries. The 26 countries treat neuroblastomas homogeneously in the same way, and there's much less variability. The centers that do clinical trials become more specialized and offer, generally can offer better care. And there's a lot of monitoring with safety and toxicity. Because of the clinical trial regulation, the toxicities are very well controlled and managed within clinical trials. And of course, even in the setting of phase 3 trials that do not make big modifications to the frontline treatments, still the patients are being randomized with new therapeutic approaches versus the standard of care. So many of them have the opportunity to have access to improved treatments. If we move now to the development of new drugs, this is a classic slide where we know that for pediatricians treating cancer, there has been a massive improvement in survival with the incorporation of multimodal treatment and intensive treatments. But this improvement has now plateaued. From 2000, we have done very, very few advances. And that is mainly due to the mortality in high-risk cancers. And as Natalie was mentioning, for example, in bone tumors, those with metastatic disease at diagnosis, those with relapse disease or with poor response still have very poor outcomes. And hence, we need to incorporate new trials. But at the same time, in this last decade, there has been a new paradigm in adult oncology, and we've heard it from it in the melanoma session, where there are some tumor types where there is a large number of new drugs that are making an impact in the survival of these patients. So, whereas there are several dozens of new drugs that have been licensed and approved for adult cancers. Very, very few of them have reached pediatric cancers and adolescents below 18. So it is challenging to translate the benefits, some of the benefits achieved by the new molecularly targeted drugs into the TYA cancers. So we need new therapies for all kinds of cancers, but also for those that happen in adolescents. And there is, of course, as you all know, different tumor types. Pediatric tumors tend to be embryonal, adult cancers tend to be carcinomas, and in the middle there is the adolescent cancers. And this graph just shows the differences. The colors are different types of cancers and how the cancers that happen in adolescents and young adults are so different from those that happen in adults. But it's not only the type of tumor, it's not only the histology. More and more with the advances in genomics, we know that the same tumor types that look the same in the microscope are also different. So we know that high-grade gliomas, even though they look the same, whether they are in children, adolescents, or adult patients, they have different molecular drivers. In adult gliomas, EGFR is a key pathway, whereas in pediatric gliomas, it is PDGFR. Medulloblastoma is another very recent example. And more, as we know, they are not exactly the same, even if they happen across different ages. And there is, it's never sufficiently highlighted the paucity of trials, the reduced number of clinical trials for the diseases that are specific for adolescents. And we have mentioned today, earlier in the morning, the example of melanoma, but there has been a revolution in adult oncology with targeted medicines that started with imatinib being used for chronic myeloid leukemia, but there are now many examples like olaparib, a PARP inhibitor for cancers with BRCA mutations. There's EGFR inhibitors for lung cancer, crizotinib for lung cancers with ALK translocations, and the BRAF inhibitors for melanoma. And very, very few of these have reached the pediatric cancers. For children, only 2 molecularly targeted drugs are licensed now. One of them is imatinib for chronic myeloid leukemia, and the other is everolimus for giant cell astrocytoma in tuberous sclerosis. So the impact of this revolution in children in clinical practice has been very, very limited to date. We know that children have fewer recurrent mutations. The biology of pediatric tumors and adolescent tumors is different, and there are less targets of these known drivers, but there's also less access to the drugs. There is less research and less knowledge of the biology, and also a lack of preclinical models. And same that we are learning that, for example, there's not only preclinical models for each tumor type, but when the drugs are developed, there is adult mice and there is young mice. There is a need to incorporate the development of the patients, of the human beings, into the preclinical models. And I wanted to mention 3 specific examples of these new targets. 2 of them we've heard extensively about them during today, but I still want to highlight them because with each of them we are learning and hopefully making advances and making better trials for the future. So for melanoma, we've heard this morning about the excellent advances with BRAF inhibitors. And these are the statistics from the UK. If there are 12,000 cases per year in the UK, 50 occur in adolescents, which is a small number, but there are 90 neuroblastomas in the whole UK. So it's still a number of patients for pediatric oncologists. It still happens, but there are less patients with advanced stage disease, and hence less patients that need treatment with adjuvant treatment. And as we've said, as we've heard from Andrea, there is a pediatric trial of vemurafenib, one BRAF inhibitor. There is going to be a pediatric trial of trametinib, at the MEK inhibitor, there is going to be there is already an open pediatric phase 1 trial of dabrafenib, which is another BRAF inhibitor. It is open, the ipilimumab pediatric study, and there will be pediatric studies below the age of 18 with the new anti-PD-1 drugs. So this is creates enormous problems to be able to recruit successfully patients for these trials. But at the same time, same that we are learning, all of us together, we are also learning with the regulators, and these pediatric investigational plans that are so controversial, with time, we think that they are improving. And same that the same European Medicines Agency that mandated that Roche develop vemurafenib exclusively for melanoma in adolescents, the same committees and the same people made that dabrafenib, which is the next BRAF inhibitor from GSK, is now being developed for any pediatric tumor with a BRAF mutation. So if you have a melanoma with a BRAF mutation, you can put the patient in, but also if you have a glioma, if you have a histiocytosis with BRAF mutations, they can also be incorporated in the trial. So the trial designs are making more sense, and if it is a MEK inhibitor and it makes sense to treat patients with aberrations of the pathway, they will enter the trial regardless of the diagnosis of the histology that they have. And I think the same will happen with the anti-PD-1. There is an important rationale to target PD-1 in other pediatric and adolescent cancers. So hopefully the pediatric regulation evolves as well and will eventually get better. This is the example that Natalie mentioned about Ewing sarcoma and IGF-1R. This patient was treated in my institution, and I looked after him for a while. And it is definitely a pity that all the drugs have stopped their development, because some of the responses were transient, but some of the patients, and Alvaro has a patient in Madrid, and each of us has a similar experience. There were patients that were treated with these IGF-1R inhibitors for years, although we haven't been able to identify which of them would benefit. I think this was the provoking title of this editorial reporting on IGF-1R inhibitors. We haven't done things well. It is a lot of it was industry that did not want to develop the drugs for a rare tumor, or the drugs were not successful for the most common adult cancers. But we haven't been able to identify those small percentage of patients that were responders. We have failed to identify which was the biological characteristic that made them respond. And we have failed to have mechanisms that even if a pharmaceutical company, a big pharmaceutical company, is not interested in the agent, then a small pharmaceutical company could rescue it. The National Cancer Institute or other organizations could rescue these drugs and still develop them for a rare tumor. And the final story is sonic hedgehog in medulloblastoma. Medulloblastoma occurs in children, adolescents, and it also occurs in adult patients. And there is a consensus now that although all medulloblastomas look the same, there are histological variants of medulloblastoma, but there is molecular subgroups of medulloblastoma with Wnt, sonic hedgehog, group 3 and group 4, and this is an international consensus on how they are classified. If you take the sonic hedgehog medulloblastomas, which are about a fourth or 20-25% of all medulloblastomas, they occur across all ages. They occur in babies, in children, and in adults. And in sonic hedgehog-driven medulloblastomas, I'll show a bigger picture of these medulloblastomas. So knowing that a fourth of medulloblastomas were driven by sonic hedgehog and that there was a sonic hedgehog inhibitor was very good news. And we thought, well, this is at least at last we have an inhibitor to give to these patients. And this inhibitor, there are two inhibitors, one from Novartis and one from Roche, and were developed very rationally. So they did phase 1 and phase 2 trials where all patients with medulloblastoma received the inhibitor. And you could see, sorry, it's a bit of a small font, but you could see that only those medulloblastomas that had a positive signature that had activation of the sonic hedgehog pathway responded. So it's very good news. More than half of the patients, of the adults and children with the activation of the pathway responded to the drug. If you didn't have activation of the pathway, no chances of responding to the drug. So that this agent, the Novartis sonic hedgehog inhibitor, evolved to a phase 3 randomized trial against the standard of care in relapsed medulloblastoma with patient selection. So you have a patient with relapsed medulloblastoma, test the patient for sonic hedgehog activation, and then recruit the patient. It is extremely complicated to recruit and to incorporate molecular testing upfront in a clinical trial. But even with all of our excitement to have a targeted therapy, we are continuing to learn with the preclinical findings that is not that simple. And very, very recently, a study analyzed 200 sonic hedgehog-driven medulloblastomas. And they showed that even sonic hedgehog-driven medulloblastomas, which we thought they were the same across ages, they're different in infants, in children, and in adults. So these different colors are mutations in different parts of the pathway. So the red ones are mutations in patch, which is here. This is the cell, the medulloblastoma cell simplified. So there is a constant, more or less constant frequency of patch mutations, but there are mutations that only occurs in children, like SUFU, and SUFU is down here, is a bit below in, and SUFU is a bit below in the pathway, it's downstream. There is young adults that have p53 mutations, and p53 mutations make them resistant to the inhibitors. And then there is other older children or young adults that have MECAN amplification. So if you're targeting your pathway with a smoothened inhibitor, which are the drugs that we have here, that works if your problem is here. But it doesn't work if the problem is below. So the more we learn, the more complex the situation becomes. And this is a nice story of how we go back and forth from the bench to the bedside and learn and continue to learn. And we're still hopeful that we will be able to find ways of targeting adult medulloblastomas and child medulloblastomas. Why are there no more clinical trials in children and in adolescents with cancer? This is statistics, a rough statistic that we did of how many drugs of the ones we knew from adult trials then eventually led to a pediatric trial. So we were sort of looking after this compound is interesting, this drug is interesting, we want to see that one has a role in this specific adolescent cancer, pediatric cancer. So more than half of them, the company was not interested in developing the drug for pediatrics. 10% of the drugs that we thought were interesting ended up having a pediatric phase 1 trial. And the rest of them, either the drug was bad, it didn't work, or it was too toxic, which, fair enough, that drug shouldn't go forward. Or the company was developing the drug, but then decided to stop developing the drug for commercial reasons. So it's difficult to do studies in patients younger than 18 because there is low interest from industry, and there is a fear that even just giving us a drug or allowing us to use investigational drugs is a risk for them, that the whole development of a new drug is put at risk by treating minors in a clinical trial. Is still that perception of doing experimentation with vulnerable minors. So there's a lot to work to improve that negative perception of doing clinical trials in young patients. But also, of course, the priorities are led by the adult market, and the drugs have a very high rate of attrition. Many of the drugs that reach phase 1-2 clinical trials in adults will finally die, will not become authorized drugs. So if you want to do clinical trials in drugs with drugs very early in their development, there are significant chances that you will not be able to use the drugs even if they work, like the example of the of the Ewing sarcoma. Of course, there is difficulties to find funding, particularly in this side of the Atlantic, because there's no pan-European funding organization or funding body. They are rare cancers, and we need to work in collaboration. We need to work multinationally, although I think we are pretty used to it. And there is less preclinical research in good models, as Natalie was highlighting, in specific and comprehensive studies of the biology of adolescent cancers. And if we move finally to how to access early clinical trials for an adolescent, for an adolescent patient with cancer, there is of course, inevitably there is pediatric studies and adult studies, and this is a map of the ITCC, which is a European consortium of pediatric oncologists that runs early clinical trials. There is about more than 40 centers. There are phase 1 trials that are not open in all the centers, and then the phase 2s are open in the majority of centers. And then the adult studies are divided between phase 1 units, which tend to be less in every country, and then phase 2 cooperative group studies, which, even though adolescent cancers are not the most frequent in adults, there are cooperative groups for sarcoma, for leukemia, and older patients can be included. But as we have highlighted a million times, age limits should not be a barrier, and the trials should be representative of the population they are treating. When I was working at Royal Marsden, we wanted to analyze how many adolescents had we treated in phase 1-2 clinical trials. And the Royal Marsden was a large pediatric clinical trials unit, and as well for adults. There are many trials. So in about, I think it was up to 16 or 17 clinical trials that we had open in 10 years, 1/3 of the patients treated by the pediatricians in the pediatric unit were adolescents, which we thought it was not that bad for having had a smaller number of clinical trials. And we went to look at how many patients, TYA patients, had been treated in the in our adult units. There was approximately 60 clinical trials, if you put together the 20 or 30 phase 1 clinical trials that were continuously open, plus the clinical trials that were open in the sarcoma, leukemia units, etc. And in 10 years, there was 25 adolescent patients treated in 33 studies, so a lot of them went from one to other study, but it's still very, very, very small numbers for one of the largest units in Europe. So that just highlights a bit more the need to insist and to refer the patients to larger centers and to have more trials where these patients can be treated. And of course, the age matters, and there is this barrier in the age of 18 that marks that the legislation marks. The adult trials, most of them treat patients above the age of 18, and the pediatrics below the age of 18. The doses in adult trials are generally flat. All patients get the same dose of targeted therapies, whereas in pediatrics, the doses are given per square meter or per kilo. If we look, for example, in Madrid, there is approximately 15 phase 1 trials, first-in-man clinical trials, where one person aged 18 or above with an advanced cancer could be treated, and we only have 3. And if you look at the phase 2 scenario, still there is a lot to do. This is the reality that we face. The adult phase 2 trials mainly focus on colorectal, breast, prostate cancers, although some of them will include patients with leukemia, sarcoma, and other more frequent diseases. And same for pediatrics. There's a number of studies in pediatrics in very rare conditions, in chronic myeloid leukemia, in lymphohistiocytosis, that are driven by the regulation in melanoma, in GIST, and the rest of the generic phase 2 trials in pediatrics still do not offer adequate access to the majority of patients that have a recurrent cancer. We have trials for medulloblastoma, high-grade gliomas. We'll have, in a couple of months, the European trials for neuroblastoma or rhabdomyosarcoma. But that does not offer a sufficient coverage so that adolescents with cancer can have a reasonable opportunity to participate in a clinical trial if that's what they wish. And there are specific concerns when giving information about a phase 1 and phase 2 trial when you are informing adolescents. If they are below 18, below 16 in some European countries, but if you're below 18, you cannot give informed consent. So you have to, your parents have to give the consent, and you can give assent. But we found that it is a complicated process and a difficult one. The patient information sheets for early clinical trials continuously are becoming more complex, longer, and more technical, despite the best efforts of ethics committees to make them simpler, but it's still a challenge. Even reading 25 pages of technical jargon about a new drug and with 1,000 lists of potential side effects. So we need to give a very, very good information, and I think there are some reports of what do adolescents want to know when they are joining a clinical trial, when they participate. And most of them always highlight that they want more information, that they always feel that more information is never, it's never short, that they want to know more and then take a reasonable decision. So you need to inform them, what is the study about, what's the purpose of the study, do they have any alternative treatments, or are there no other alternatives at that time? Of the benefits and risks. And that is, of course, difficult because the risks, we know some of the expected toxicities, but with new drugs, there is a risk that something new comes up and can be really problematic. And same for the benefits. In general, in phase 1 trials, there's very, very, very little benefit. There's less than 5% of patients continue on a phase 1 trial for more than a couple of months. But with the incorporation of molecularly targeted therapies, the expected benefits are increasing. And as Natalie showed in her slide, the world is full of very, very keen clinicians to put patients and very excited about each new drug that is coming. Clearly, the new studies that have molecular preselection have a higher expectation of benefit for the patients and for the clinicians. But still, if it's a phase 1 trial, the information has to be very clear of the very limited benefits that the patient can have. You need to inform them about the schedule, the number of visits that they have to do, the extra visits that they have to do to the hospital. If there are more biomarker studies, more procedures, as the trials become more complicated, they incorporate biopsies, that you need to pull your hair follicles, you need to provide a piece of your skin swab, etc. So you need to inform them about what's going to happen to them if there are contraception measures, and then inform them that it's voluntary and that all the information will be treated confidentially. And there are many reasons why people look for treatment on a phase 1 trial. And in adolescents, it's particularly important to find out whether they are truly interested in the trial. And there are many adolescents that want to try something new, that have altruistic feelings and want to do it because they understand that it will benefit other patients. But there are also other adolescents that are scared, that just want to do what their parents want. And that is difficult to find out in a clinic visit in 1 hour or 2 hours, particularly when they've come from far away to receive information about the trial. Just in order to finalize, to highlight a few issues on how to support adolescents and young adults when they participate in early clinical trials. It is extremely important to collaborate with your symptom care or your palliative care team. When they enter the clinical trial, they have advanced disease. It doesn't mean that they have to be looked after by the palliative care team, but they have to have met them, they have to have contact with them, and some of them have complex problems because of the cancer or the treatments that they have had. So they might have complex pain, complex vomiting that will definitely benefit from a close contact with the palliative care team. We have to develop a good relationship with them, and there has to be a key worker. There is a person that the adolescents can always find, and that sometimes can be the physician, sometimes it is one of the nurses, sometimes is a member of the team, the psychologist, a member of the team where they go to when they want to ask questions, when they want advice. And I've seen a couple of times that the adolescents sign the consent when they are with their parents, but then a week after that they talk to one of the nurses and say, which they have which they feel better. They talk with one of the nurses in confidence and they say, well, I don't want to be in this trial, I just want to go back to my house and be with my friends. So it's important that we identify the key worker and the person that is going to be closely working with the adolescents. We need to have a clear idea that they agree to participate, they want to participate. We need to provide them psychological support with an appropriate for their age and with an appropriate environment. We need to be aware that the toxicities that we see in with molecularly targeted agents are different from the chemotherapy toxicities that we are used to. So in general, they will have moderate toxicities, which some of them can be very upsetting, because it is very upsetting to have for months fatigue or to have for months nausea and vomiting, to have diarrhea. So we have to look after that. And of course, even with new molecularly targeted therapies, they can develop severe toxicities. And even they have to come very, very often to the hospital for all the trial-related procedures. It is crucial to ensure that they can go to school, they can stay with their friends, and to minimize the time, the visits that they do to the hospital. So in conclusion, there is a clear need to increase the participation and the access to clinical trials for adolescents and young adults in Europe. We need more drugs available, and more there are clinical trials are opening, and they will include adolescents with cancer. The adult trials, as has been highlighted before, should go for lower ages. It is clear that if at the very, very beginning of the development, if you want the adult dose, then you look for it in adults. If you want the pediatric dose, you look for it in children. But once that very, very first step has been identified or has been done, there's no justification for a legal age cutoff. We need to improve our understanding of the biology of TYA cancer and improve the communication with the researchers, the clinicians and the researchers. We need to work on trials specific for TYA diseases and improve, as Andrea was mentioning this morning, the referral pathways and the support that we give to them. So I think that's it. I'll say thank you to all the people that work with me in the unit and Royal Marsden. Any questions?
Thank you so much. This is Katie Rizvi from Romania. Thank you very, very much for this informative talk. One of your very first slides was about participation in clinical trials, and you said that more than 60% of all children under 15 in Europe, actually that's my question, are participating in clinical trials. Was that for Europe?
Because of the data came from the US. So the data for adolescents and so forth was from one of the JCO papers, and the 60% was from the National Cancer Institute. So I gather it also depends with the time, but definitely that's data from probably the Children's Oncology Group.
Thank you. Sorry, I wasn't paying attention.
Andrea?
Excellent overview on the burning issue of phase 1, phase 2 trial. I think that there are many obstacles to overcome. It's a long process and so on. But I want to give a provocative and polemic sentence because there are some more easy steps that can be solved. And and someone are not solved because we must say that many people are interested in phase 1, phase 2 study as respect to phase 3 frontline therapy, because phase 1, phase 2 study bring money, bring visibility, and publish paper and so on, more than from frontline therapy. And this means that there is many people that look for money, for power, and sometimes there are excellent research that are working on phase 1, phase 2 trial on rhabdomyosarcoma, but cannot be the same for melanoma or for GIST. And this is one of the real problems we have to face in the real life, because in many situations, some trials fail in recruit patients just because the people involved in building the trial or in look for the patient are not the people that are real experts on melanoma, GIST, and so on. And this is related to the structure we have in Europe, with the SIOP Europe, with the TCC. I'm not sure that this is the setting to do this, to say this, but probably I cannot say in another setting. But the people that are working on ENCCA, on SIOP Europe, on CRC are always the same, and cannot be the expert of everything. And this is one of the big problems in developing trial, in particular in rare tumor.
I think
it's not a question.
No. I mean, I think I agree. There is, or if I want to be optimistic, which I am, I think if we look at 5 or 10 years ago, there was no pediatric clinical trials or no pediatric clinical trials of new drugs, just when the new regulation started and pharma was not interested in developing drugs for childhood cancer. So there was no trials at all. So now there are more drugs that are being tested in phase 1 trials, and we've seen that in the last 5 years. There's more trials and more patients. Out of these drugs, very, very few move forward into phase 2 or phase 3, and they don't move forward because of those reasons. Sometimes because they're not good drugs, but less. That's the least frequent reason. Most of the times it's because of company interests or other reasons. So we are starting to see some examples of these molecularly targeted agents reaching larger clinical trials. But when more drugs are available and become available for larger clinical trials, it will be crucial, the interaction with each of the tumor groups, with each of the experts. It will be difficult even for rhabdomyosarcomas, neuroblastomas that have larger networks, even more for the rarer tumors.
Any more questions? I have a comment, but I want your opinion. I think we are complaining about having very few clinical trials in children and in adolescents, but I think the question is, are we referring the patients to the clinical trials? Because in Spain, we know cases that they meet the inclusion criteria for the clinical trials, and the patients are not referred to the centers. So I think the first question we have to give us when we have a new patient or a relapsed patient is there a clinical trial open for this patient? And it doesn't matter if I don't have it in my hospital or I don't have it in my city. The first thing is to send the patient to that clinical trial.
And probably in that aspect, the most important people to voice that up is the patients and the parents. And when you ask the patients and the parents, they want more access and they want the information that they can or cannot opt to go or to be referred for a clinical trial. I mean, again, I think I'm optimistic in that, and I think we are improving with that, improving the information that physicians have and patients have, but there's a lot of work to do yet.
Thank you very much. Sue Morgan from Leeds in the UK. We do an awful lot of work, as you all do, with teenagers and young adults. And within our MDT, in the way that we work in the UK now, we are duty-bound to offer the young person a clinical trial or to make sure that they're being treated in the right place to have a clinical trial. That's the gold standard. But when you talk to young people about clinical trials, they don't always understand what it is that we want to enter them on. And it's about how do we get young people to understand about research, because they think they're going to be guinea pigs, they think they'll either have good treatment or bad treatment. So it's about getting over from us to the young people about what clinical trials are and to get them to come onto them. And I think that a lot of work's been done in the UK on that. And the young people don't understand. So it's about us as well, making sure that young people understand what it is that we're trying to enter them on. That was a comment.
So, thank you very much.